The intake system would let me classify the incoming vessel as distressed, contaminated, armed, or sovereign. It would not let me classify it as all four, which is what the signal said. That was the first problem. Not the alien craft itself. Not the fact that it had entered the lunar humanitarian corridor under silent burn and then dumped a compressed packet in mathematics. No one disputed. The first problem was that Meridian civil quarantine had no form for a species we had never met arriving half-disabled, refusing boarding, requesting sterile distance, and invoking a legal marker. Our machine layer kept translating as intact enemy. Comment where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. I was 28, in my second probationary year as a quarantine language analyst, and still one formal mistake away from losing the posting that kept my mother on her treatment allotment in Pune. 3 years earlier, I had attached an unauthorized interpretive note to a refugee transfer file and been told, in the careful language administrations use when they want to sound generous, that precision and empathy were not the same skill. Meridian was my way back from that. I handled contact phrasing between customs, biosecurity, and legal. In practice, that meant people twice my rank asked me what a sentence meant, then ignored the answer if it complicated the clock they were already watching. The contact packet came in on a Tuesday rotation while I was trying to clear a fungal exemption for a cargo ring from Callisto. The alien craft had tagged itself with 3 stable markers and 1 unstable one. Distress was clear enough, so was contamination. Sovereign, probably. The unstable marker sat in the same structural slot as the word our archive models usually rendered as weapon. Not hostile weapon, more like operative instrument, the thing a polity relied on when it needed to act with force. Security saw that and hardened immediately. Legal saw sovereign plus weapon and wanted standoff recognition only. Medical saw distress plus falling life support pressure and wanted to board within the hour. The craft was still outside hard dock at that point, visible only as a dark spindle in the outer camera arc with 1 drive plane blistered and a slow gas plume leaking from the aft seam. Nothing about it looked theatrical. That made the institutional tone around it stranger, not calmer. Historic events come with ordinary camera angles more often than people like to admit. My immediate superior, Director Halden Voss, took the official view before any of us had finished our first translation sweep. The vessel, he said, would be handled as a first contact distress arrival under armed quarantine protocol. That meant no boarding without reciprocal acknowledgement, no transfer of bodies or equipment until identity hierarchy was established, and no public language suggesting either hospitality or hostility before the presidency approved a line. It was a defensible framework. It had been written for unknowns, and this was an unknown. The problem was that the framework assumed a functioning distinction between patient, crew, envoy, and weapon. The packet we received kept collapsing those categories into each other. Dr. Lena Afsar, head of exobiological medicine, said that out loud before I did. She was the kind of physician administrators found irritating because she was too procedural to dismiss and too morally stubborn to manage easily. "If we wait for clean identity," she said, standing beside my console with her hair still damp from decon, "we may be waiting for corpses to become easier to categorize." Voss answered without looking at her. "And if we board an armed sovereign vessel under contamination seal, we may begin first contact by committing a seizure." "That depends what they think boarding means. That depends what they say it means. That," she said, "is why he has a job." She meant me. Voss did not enjoy being reminded of that. The first full machine pass made everything worse. The unstable marker resolved, not into weapon exactly, but into a cluster of terms that our systems distributed across aggression, claim, custody, and decisive action. Public-facing people later simplified this into the aliens thinking aggression was our weapon. That was close enough to survive headlines, but the live problem was more technical and more dangerous. Their language seemed to assume that when one polity imposed cost on another, it also claimed some responsibility for whatever remained afterward. In our languages, those ideas are separated. You can attack without taking custody. You can rescue without claiming ownership. Their signal grammar kept binding the concepts together. The first direct sentence we translated from them came through the legal layer before the linguistic one because the metadata was cleaner than the words. Distress acknowledged. Do not enter by claim. That looked almost sensible, right up until it didn't. Security read it as a warning against boarding. Legal read it as a refusal of contact. Medical asked what by claim meant. I said I didn't know yet. The machine layer preferred conquest, but only because our archives fed it too much military history and too little funeral law. Lena asked for raw structure. I asked for more time. Voss asked for a response the presidency could live with. That is how procedure becomes tension. Not because people are stupid, but because every department needs a different kind of clarity from the same unclear line. We sent the standard humanitarian acknowledgement first. It had been approved years earlier for unidentified life support emergencies. Meridian offers technical assistance under quarantine law. Persons requiring stabilization may be taken into temporary protective custody pending consent review. I signed the transmission because it was routine. That is another sentence I have replayed too often. The alien vessel answered in 13 seconds, faster than before, which usually meant either successful comprehension or successful offense. The machine layer gave us this. Protective custody equals claim. Claim equals continuation of strike. Do not continue strike. No one in the room used the word disaster. We were still too early for that. What we had, in bureaucratic terms, was a mapping failure under time pressure. Their craft had 94 minutes of stable environmental reserve by medical estimate. The craft's own telemetry disagreed, but not in ways we could trust. A particle front from a minor solar event would foul the outer docking corridor in just under 3 hours. If they were still outside hard seal when that happened, Meridian would have to move them to remote quarantine or violate its own contamination regulations. Meanwhile, the public feed had already noticed the object and the silence around it. The leak that changed the politics was small and avoidable. Someone in media stabilization got hold of the preliminary archive correlation packet and saw the weapon cluster beside human historical files. Within 20 minutes, 2 major Earthside outlets were running variations of the same line. Alien contact signal references human aggression as primary capacity. That was enough. Commentators did what commentators do. One block called it slander, another called it realism. A third said humanity was being profiled as a violent species before contact had even begun. None of them had the raw metadata. All of them had audiences. The presidency requested wording. Voss wanted something firm but neutral. Public affairs wanted something that would calm markets. Legal wanted nothing issued until recognition status was established. The final holding statement reached the feeds 32 minutes later. Humanity accepts contact without intimidation. At the time, it sounded fine. In retrospect, it was almost perfectly calibrated to make the translation problem worse. If their framework bound aggression to claim and claim to responsibility, then, without intimidation, could only land in a very narrow band of meanings. It either denied fear while preserving readiness for force, or it declared that we believed ourselves unclaimable. Both readings moved us farther from the one thing we actually needed to say, which was simpler. We were trying to help without taking possession. Their next packet came slower and more formal. If no intimidation, why custody language? If no strike, why approach by claim? If no claim, send no seizure frame. That last phrase occupied us for 12 full minutes because none of the layers agreed on it. Our machine model liked boarding tube. Security thought it meant assault geometry. Lena, who had spent enough time with medical hardware to distrust clean nouns, asked for the visual feed from our docking gantries. That was when we noticed the aliens had adjusted their attitude jets the moment our boarding arm extended to standby. Not a tactical move, a recoil move. The craft had physically responded to the sight of our standard rescue geometry as if the arm itself meant capture. Voss still had a reasonable case. He said first contact could not be dictated by one distressed unknown vessel rewriting basic station procedure with ambiguous phrasing. If the craft considered any form of approach hostile, Then the station either had to accept remote exchange only or classify the vessel as non-cooperative under armed quarantine. Both categories preserved institutional control. Both were legible. That mattered to him because he was responsible for a civilian station, not a philosophy seminar. Lena's case was also reasonable. She said categories were already failing, and the vessel's behavior suggested not generic hostility, but a specific misinterpretation tied to our rescue procedure. "They aren't objecting to us existing," she said. "They are objecting to how we enter." Voss replied, "Then they can explain that more usefully." I said, perhaps more sharply than was wise, "They may think they already have." Neither of them liked me very much in that moment. The deadliest part of procedural systems is that they do not wait for your best insight. They wait for the next threshold. At T-minus 63 minutes to environmental failure, automated quarantine doctrine forced a branch. Unknown. Distressed vessels that refuse boarding and preserve armed status are escalated to remote stabilization or remote containment depending on recognized intent. Recognized intent was exactly what we did not have. Medical pushed hard for remote stabilization. Atmosphere mix, thermal blankets, sealant foam, exterior patch drones. Security preferred remote containment first, on the entirely sane ground that nobody wanted to spray station-built compounds across an alien hull carrying an unresolved force marker. Voss split the difference in the most institutional way possible. He approved exterior stabilization through unmanned frames only. No physical penetration, no boarding, and no direct transfer until intent clarification. It was meant as restraint. It landed as escalation. We announced the plan through simplified trade language. The translation layer was stripped down for clarity, which is another way of saying it lost exactly the nuance we needed. We told them we would secure the hull, restrict movement vectors, and maintain life support from outside. In human rescue doctrine, that means we will stop you from dying while preserving quarantine boundaries. Their reply came almost immediately, and the machine layer rendered it in a way that made security sit straighter. Securing hull equals binding a hostile. Restricting vectors equals disabling agency. Outside maintenance after strike confirms capture. Lena swore softly. Voss said, "Or it confirms they intend to dictate terms while armed." Neither of them was speaking irrationally. That is what made the room so dangerous. By then, the station had another problem. The first presidential liaison wanted visual proof of progress before the next media cycle. Investors were already moving shipping futures based on whether first contact looked manageable. Two parliamentary blocs were demanding that any alien vessel classifying human aggression as primary capacity be denied immediate docking until it renounced prejudice. I saw those words on the side channel and felt, with perfect clarity, that public language was now participating in the event instead of reporting it. The vessel's telemetry dipped again. Lena requested emergency override to board under medical necessity. Voss refused because no recognized consent existed, and because if he allowed a civilian med team onto an armed alien craft after public hostility discourse had already started, he would lose half the station board before dawn. He turned to me instead. "Find a phrase," he said. We were feeding a misunderstanding and then reading the result as confirmation. Lena said it first in a form everyone in the room could grasp. "They think our rescue law is a conquest ritual." Voss stared at the packet for several seconds without speaking. Every time our messages included take, hold, custody, secure, or restrict, the alien craft answered fast, almost reflexively. Every time our lines referenced atmosphere, pain, temperature, or duration, the pause lengthened. Not random lengthening, regular, structured, as if the craft was consulting multiple internal sources before replying. The pattern made me suspect two things at once. One, that our so-called tactical terms were mapping onto a deeply stable threat category. Two, that bodily state terms required a collective or consensual response we did not understand. I brought that to Lena. She looked at the timing ladder and said, "They decide harm quickly and care slowly." I said, "Or they decide care together." That sentence stayed with me. Voss gave us 11 more minutes before he said the station could not keep improvising under live scrutiny. If we had no better interpretation by then, he would authorize full remote containment under hazardous sovereignty protocol. That meant magnetic restraint, external power denial except for monitored feeds, and automated neutralization of any uncontrolled ejections. No guns, no boarding, no visible violence, just a series of very human procedural acts designed to stop a situation from becoming harder to manage. I understood why he chose it. I also knew, without being able to prove it yet, that if we took that step, the aliens would not hear containment. They would hear continuation. At T-minus 42 minutes, with my clearance token and Voss's order code, I opened the remote containment checklist. The checklist itself was almost insultingly calm. Confirm outer corridor clear. Confirm station insurance lock. Confirm remote frames synchronized. Confirm public affairs holding line updated. Hazard protocols are written in verbs that reassure the people signing them. I got as far as restraint geometry authorization before the alien craft transmitted a burst so compressed our trade layer could not unfold it in real time. The raw structure hit the linguistic queue first, then the legal parser, then the telemetry mirror. 3 different systems flared red at once for 3 different reasons. The legal parser marked it as a kin declaration. The telemetry mirror flagged the packet because it included live physiological markers. The linguistic queue failed because the source phrase nested plurality in a way our models kept flattening. The nearest trade output we got was this: "You are choosing the victor's care." That line halted the room because everyone thought they understood it, and no one did. Security heard it as ideological theater. Public affairs heard it as a phrase that would destroy the feed if it leaked. Lena heard it as the first time the vessel had clearly named what it feared. I heard something narrower. Not victor's rights. Not conqueror's pride. Care by the victor. The same binding again. Harm and custody as a single legal act. Then another packet followed, shorter and more devastating because the machine layer rendered it too cleanly. Do not make our injured yours. That sentence changed the room because it finally gave our abstract problem a human shape. The alien vessel was not bargaining for tactical advantage in the way security had modeled. It was trying to prevent a category of rescue that, in its framework, erased or absorbed the people being rescued. Lena turned to Voss immediately. "Stop containment. Now." Voss said, "Or we have discovered their leverage phrase." "Listen to the body data," she said. "They're transmitting pain metrics, not threats." He asked me if that was true. I said yes, though the yes needed explanation. In the last 4 packets, alongside the linguistic structure, the vessel had appended temperature drift, gas saturation, circulatory collapse markers, and 1 repeating index that mapped most closely to unrecovered trauma. Not performance stats, not reactor faults. Patient telemetry. They were not just telling us they had injured aboard. They were making the fact of injury part of the legal communication. That was when the semantic breakthrough began, though not all at once. It came from 3 small things lining up. First, the unstable marker we had been reading through aggression and weapon archives did not sit next to force terms in their packet. It sat next to burden, continuation, and aftermath. Our models preferred weapon only because human archives pair force with decisive action constantly. In their grammar, the marker was closer to instrument of imposition, what one polity uses to make another carry altered conditions. Aggression was one example. So was custody. So was rescue, if rescue transferred control without consent. Second, the response delays made sense once we stopped assuming command hierarchy. Their fast replies were threat recognitions because any individual could identify imposed claim. Their slow replies on medical terms were collective because bodily vulnerability, in their law, could not be spoken for by a single intact person if injured others were present. They were not stalling. They were refusing singular representation under conditions of shared impairment. Third, and most humiliating for us, the public discourse had already contaminated the translation field. Once our media framed the contact around human intimidation and alien judgment, our own language kept drifting toward sovereignty display. Then he said, And if we stop acting, they die. That was always true, she said. The policy clock did not care that we were finally understanding. The vessel still had less than 40 minutes of workable reserve. The solar particulate front was still advancing. If we paused every action until consensus language was perfect, we would achieve semantic purity over a dead craft. If we proceeded under the existing framework, we risked turning a mistranslation into a species-level memory of predation. That is why these events never have clean heroes, only people choosing which failure they can live with. Voss wanted a legally contained correction. He proposed a new message stating that Meridian disclaimed salvage rights and would provide remote stabilization only with no transfer of persons. It was better than what we had sent. It was still wrong for one reason. The vessel's packets suggested that external life support manipulation, if imposed unilaterally, still counted as care by claim. We would simply be refining the vocabulary of the same mistake. Lena wanted a riskier move. She said we needed to state two things the station would hate saying, that we would not claim the injured, and that our response would be plural, not singular. Not one official voice speaking ownership-neutral benevolence. Multiple human roles assuming witness together. Medical, legal, kin equivalent if available. We had no kin equivalent, obviously, but we could at least stop presenting one authorized mouth as if that settled the moral geometry. Voss answered with the line the inquiry later quoted because it summarized the whole disaster in 12 words. We need a decision. Lena said, we need a correct decision. He looked at the reserve clock and said, those are not the same thing. I remember that line because it was the last moment before I acted without permission. What made the choice costly was not abstract conscience. It was arithmetic. If I broke chain of command again after my previous disciplinary record, I would almost certainly lose Meridian, the salary, and the medical continuation package that depended on federal employment. My mother had 63 days left on her current support authorization. I knew the number because children of sick parents learn expiration dates the way other people learn birthdays. I sent the unauthorized message anyway. I used the stripped trade band not because it was elegant, but because everything elegant had failed us already. I pulled the verbs out to the shortest forms our model trusted and built the sentence around the one thing we finally understood mattered. Many human mouths answer. We will spend air and time. We will not own your injured. If you permit, we will share witness and keep life. In their pre-contact models, aggression and care belonged to the same chain. Power imposed, then incorporated. The idea of incurring cost without annexing the beneficiary had been filed under unstable altruism, too rare for doctrine. Voss said my name once, quietly, in the tone people use when they are already calculating damage reports. No one dragged me from the room because everyone was looking at the incoming text. The alien reply came slower than any previous packet. When it arrived, half the machine layer failed because our systems still wanted a single answer source and the vessel had clearly transmitted from several. The stable trade rendering after 3 passes read like this. Plural answer recognized. Witness without claim is not strike. Approach by shared witness permitted. No severing of the burdened. That last line generated immediate new conflict because medical doctrine on Meridian required patient separation, sterile triage, and independent monitoring. No severing was not a decorative condition. The live hull scan suggested at least 3 alien bodies were linked through conductive membrane harnesses and shared thermal exchange. Our quarantine manuals would cut those links first and ask questions second. Doing what the craft asked meant violating every contamination pathway standard in the station book. Lena said we would do it. Voss said the station could not invent xenomedicine from moral enthusiasm. Lena said, then it can invent a waiver and save first contact. To his credit, Voss moved. He did not become a visionary. He became what administrators are at their best under pressure, flexible faster than the institution around him. He froze remote containment, ordered engineering to disable automatic separation routines on berth 3, called legal for emergency plural contact authority, and told public affairs to prepare a statement acknowledging an active humanitarian exchange under revised protocol. It was not a confession. It was enough. The boarding itself was procedural and tense in exactly the way the public never believes. No dramatic breach, no speeches through fog, just layered authorization, environmental math, and 6 people choosing every word as if language had become a handrail over open space. Lena led medical. I went because the alien reply had specified the mouth that changed the phrasing. Voss came because station authority mattered if anything went wrong. 2 biosecurity nurses and 1 systems tech completed the team. We stripped to soft gear, no visible restraints, no extraction stretchers, no powered cutters. Even the med crates were repacked because standard custody red tagging looked too much like seizure coding once you knew what the other side feared. When the inner barrier cleared, the smell hit first. Not rot or blood in any familiar sense. Resin, heat, mineral vapor, and something like singed spice. The aliens were arranged in a way that forced our categories to fail again. 3 injured bodies and 1 intact delegate were linked by membrane bands running from sternum to wrist, with the bands lit by faint pulses that tracked breath and pulse together. Not a hive, not a single organism, not separate patients either. Shared burden made material. The intact delegate looked directly at me and said, through the trade lattice, "Which mouth refused claim?" I said I had. They answered, "Then witness." That was not a title, it was an instruction. What happened next is one of the reasons the public later preferred the military-sounding version of the story. It was harder to mythologize the truth. The truth was a room full of trained people doing slow, careful, compassionate work under hostile legal uncertainty. Lena examined without cutting the membrane bands. The nurses matched temperature gradients rather than imposing our baseline norms. The system's tech rerouted power through an exterior manifold so we would not have to detach their failing internal exchangers. Voss, who had spent the day guarding institutional control, stood in a hot suit for 2 hours and read approved station assurances line by line whenever the delegate asked whether our actions implied claim. Each time, we denied claim and affirmed witness. The thing the aliens later said surprised them was not that humans could be violent. They had read enough of us to know that already. What surprised them was that once we understood the category, we kept spending resources on people we could not own, tax, convert, or strategically use. Meridian turned it into procedure under pressure, which is a much stronger thing. We lost one of their injured anyway. He died 31 minutes after birth entry, while the shared membrane still linked him to the others. No one on our side touched the bands. No one pretended the correction had erased the delay we had already caused. The delegate asked for the death to be recorded in the same file as the first mistranslation. Voss agreed. That cost him politically later, but not agreeing would have cost us more. By dawn, the immediate catastrophe had been reduced, not resolved. The surviving aliens accepted short-term treatment under a term our translators eventually rendered as witnessed care. They declined formal recognition talks. They declined technology exchange. They declined media appearance. What they did do, before entering sealed recovery, was transmit a legal note to the Coalition Assembly and every major human jurisdiction with a public channel. The note did not accuse humanity of malice. In some ways, that made it worse. It described our initial response as a repeatable category error common to species whose emergency law evolved from property seizure and battlefield detention. It said humanity treated rescue, custody, and control as separable, where their law did not. It said contact with humans would proceed only under a newly defined status until that error was institutionally addressed. That status was translated, after much argument, as non-appropriative emergency standing. Everything after that became policy. I lost my post 3 days later for unauthorized transmission during first contact operations. The dismissal letter was perfectly correct and carefully phrased. It thanked me for my service, acknowledged that later revisions had incorporated elements of the message I sent, and concluded that unilateral deviation under live diplomatic conditions could not be normalized. My mother's treatment extension was denied on the first review and reinstated only after Lena spent what little personal capital she had left forcing a discretionary appeal. Voss was censured, survived it, and later chaired the Doctrine Revision Board because governments prefer disgraced experts to clean outsiders. Lena was removed from operational leadership and buried in training design, which was how she ended up changing more than any of us. The public memory formed quickly and badly. On one side were people who said humans had stared down an alien attempt to control the terms of first contact. On the other were people who said the entire event proved humans were too procedurally violent for safe interspecies relations. Both narratives were usable. Neither captured what happened on Birth 3. What happened was narrower and more embarrassing. We kept using the wrong framework because our institutions had been trained to see unknown vulnerability through the grammar of control. We were not uniquely cruel. We were historically specific, and first contact made the specificity visible. The policy aftershock lasted. First, every human contact doctrine now includes a mandatory semantic hold before any non-human distress rescue can invoke the words custody, secure, contain, recover, or transfer. Those verbs are locked behind cross-domain review because Meridian showed how much damage a familiar verb can do when another species hears it through a different history. Second, no first contact or distress negotiation may proceed through a single authorized human representative if the counterpart language shows collective standing markers. The rule is called plural witness requirement in the manuals. People forget where it came from. I do not. Third, human rescue law had to create a new category it had never needed for itself: aid without claim. Not sovereignty waiver, not asylum, not prisoner transfer, not salvage, not quarantine custody. Care that does not make the cared for yours. The legal drafts were brutal because half our statutes assumed ownership or detention at the edge of survival. It took 18 months to write language that felt obvious only after the catastrophe forced it. And because institutions always leave a scar where they learn, there was one more consequence. Public training modules about Meridian use a simplified case study built around translation ambiguity and emergency de-escalation. The modules do not mention my name. They do not mention that the first correct sentence was unauthorized. They do not mention that the aliens' initial classification of human aggression as operative instrument came from reading our own archives more honestly than we did. They mostly teach people to wait for plural context and never extend a boarding arm before relational status is clear. The memorial on Meridian is also wrong, though less wrong than the first draft. It names the alien who died in care, notes that the first exchange occurred under procedural misclassification, and praises the station for reestablishing trust through humanitarian conduct. That wording survived because it offends fewer governments than the alternative. The alternative would have said that trust was not reestablished. It was built for the first time only after the station stopped trying to own the act of rescue. I still have copies of the raw packets, though I am not supposed to. Not because I think history forgot me. History forgets junior people by design. I kept them because I wanted one record untouched by training edits or anniversary speeches. When I open them, I don't go first to the famous lines about witnessed care or non-appropriative standing. I go back to the sentence I signed before anyone knew enough to be ashamed. Persons requiring stabilization may be taken into temporary protective custody pending consent review. It looked humane in our law. It arrived as continuation of strike in theirs. That is the part I remember when people say aliens thought our aggression was our weapon. They did think that, or something close to it. What they had not modeled was that humans, once forced to see the category clearly enough, could make compassion procedural faster than pride could stop us. Not pure compassion, not saintly compassion, institutional, compromised, expensive compassion with signatures, waivers, and people losing their jobs for the wording. History remembers first contact at Meridian as a diplomatic near failure that led to the witness accords. I remember the delay between two packets, the sound of Lena saying we needed a correct decision, and the line I sent because the approved language had run out. We will spend air and time. We will not own your injured.